Think about the last time you were in a heated disagreement. Chances are, at some point, the actual topic stopped mattering. What mattered was who was going to come out ahead. That shift, from understanding to winning, happens almost automatically in most people. It's so common that we barely notice it. But there are people who never make that shift. Not because they don't have strong opinions. Not because they're conflict-averse or indifferent to being right. But because they're operating from a fundamentally different set of priorities, and it shows up in a very specific collection of traits. Here are 7 of them. The first trait is the most foundational. People who never argue to win are genuinely trying to understand something, not to prove something. When they enter a disagreement, the question driving them isn't, how do I demonstrate that I'm right? It's what am I missing, and what does this person know that I don't? That orientation, toward the conversation as a source of information rather than a battlefield, changes everything about how they engage. It means they actually listen to what the other person is saying rather than waiting for a gap to reinsert their own point. It means they're capable of being surprised mid-conversation, of having their thinking genuinely shifted by something they hear. And it means the person they're talking to often leaves the exchange feeling heard rather than defeated, which is a rare and meaningful thing. The second trait is what makes the first one possible. These people can hold their opinions firmly without needing anyone else to validate them. Their confidence in a position doesn't depend on the other person agreeing with it. They can state what they think clearly, hear a rebuttal, and maintain their view without feeling threatened, or change their view without feeling diminished. Either outcome is acceptable because neither one defines their self-worth. Psychologists who study ego involvement in attitudes have found that people differ dramatically in how personally they experience challenges to their beliefs. For many people, being told they're wrong registers as a social threat, a challenge to their competence, their credibility, their standing. For people who never argue to win, that connection between their opinions and their identity is simply weaker. Their view is something they hold, not something they are. And that distinction makes genuine intellectual exchange possible in a way it isn't for people who can't separate the two. The third trait follows naturally. They listen to understand, not to respond. Most people in disagreements are doing something that looks like listening, but is actually preparation. They're monitoring the other person's words for the moment to jump back in. For the weakness in the argument they can exploit, for the point they've been waiting to make. The content of what's being said matters less than the opportunity it creates. People who never argue to win actually process what they're hearing. They're not formulating a counter while the other person is still speaking. They're taking it in, turning it over, measuring it against what they already think. And because of that, they occasionally do something that most people in arguments never do. They change their mind in real time. Not performatively, not as a strategic concession, but because they actually heard something that moved their thinking. The fourth trait is one that most people find genuinely difficult. Before we get to it, there's something worth pausing on about what the first 3 traits produce together. A person who is genuinely trying to understand, who doesn't need validation from the other person, and who is actually listening, that person creates a different kind of conversational environment. The person they're talking to often relaxes in a way they don't expect. The defensiveness that most arguments trigger doesn't get activated in the same way. And when defensiveness goes down, thinking quality tends to go up for both people. These aren't just personal traits. They change the dynamic of the whole exchange. They're comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. They don't need every question to have a clear, decisive answer right now. When a conversation surfaces genuine complexity, when the honest answer is, I'm not sure, or there are things to be said for both sides, they can sit with that without it feeling like failure. For most people, admitting uncertainty in an argument feels like losing ground. Acknowledging complexity feels like retreat. But for people who are trying to understand rather than win, uncertainty is just an accurate description of a complicated situation. They're not performing confidence they don't have. They're not simplifying a nuanced reality to make their position easier to defend. They're willing to say, I don't know, and mean it, which makes everything they do claim more credible. The fifth trait is closely related to the second, but more specific. They have separated their sense of self from their opinions. Being proven wrong doesn't feel like an attack on who they are. It feels like new information about how the world works, which, when you think about it, is what it actually is. This sounds simple, but it requires a kind of psychological groundedness that is much rarer than it appears. Most people's opinions are entangled with their self-image in ways they don't fully recognize. To challenge the opinion is to challenge the person. To admit the opinion was wrong is to admit something was wrong with them. People who never argue to win have, somewhere along the way, untangled those two things. Their intellectual positions are revisable. Their core sense of themselves is not. And that separation gives them a freedom in conversation that most people simply don't have access to. The sixth trait is the one that most distinguishes these people from those who simply avoid conflict. They know when to let go, and the reason they let go is not that they've lost. It's that they've recognized the conversation is no longer producing anything worth having. There's a specific moment in many arguments when it becomes clear that no new information is being exchanged, that neither person is going to move, and that continuing is purely about dominance rather than understanding. Most people push through that moment because stopping feels like conceding. People who never argue to win can recognize that moment and step back from it, cleanly, without lingering resentment, because their investment was never in winning. It was in the conversation itself. And when the conversation has run out of useful ground to cover, there's nothing left worth fighting for. The seventh trait is perhaps the most quietly powerful. Their influence tends to arrive later, not in the moment. When these people are in a disagreement, they rarely win in the conventional sense. They don't back the other person into a corner. They don't produce the devastating closing argument. They don't leave the room with the last word. But something else often happens. The person they were talking to thinks about the conversation afterward, finds themselves reconsidering, comes back days later and says, I've been thinking about what you said. This is how genuine influence actually works, not through pressure, but through clarity. Not by forcing someone to change their mind in the moment, but by giving them something worth thinking about after. People who argue to win get compliance. People who never argue to win occasionally get something harder to achieve and more lasting. Actual change in how someone thinks. It is also worth saying something about what these people are not. They are not pushovers. They are not people who agree with everything to avoid friction. They are not conflict-averse in the sense of backing down from positions they hold. In fact, because their self-worth isn't tied to winning, they can often be more persistent and more direct than people who argue aggressively, because they're not managing ego, just pursuing clarity. The difference between someone who never argues to win and someone who avoids conflict entirely is significant. And it's worth being clear, what we're describing is not the absence of conviction. It's conviction without the need for dominance. Taken together, these 7 traits describe a person who has made a quiet but significant decision. That being understood matters more than being declared right. And that the quality of the thinking that comes out of a conversation matters more than who prevailed in it. In a world that rewards the loudest, most aggressive arguers, that mistakes certainty for intelligence and volume for conviction, that's a genuinely rare way to be. If that resonated, leave a comment. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the next video.